Good morning, everybody. Welcome. For lots of you, welcome back. I can see that we've got a lot of familiar faces in the participant list. It's so great to see that so many of you are taking in the whole series. And so along with that, I'm just looking at the numbers here. Along with that, I have a bit of almost an apology to make. I'm going to run through an introduction that many of you have already heard. So just like last week, I wanted to say thanks again for your patience as I do run through the introductions. They're important, of course, and they're essential for people who are joining us who haven't been here for the whole of the series and for folks who are watching the recordings. So again, welcome for those of you who are new to this series, and welcome back to those of you who are coming with us for the whole 8 talks. We've received some really great feedback over email, and I just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to send that in. It's nice for us to receive that. It's nice for us to get your questions after the fact, and just to see and hear that you're sharing the recordings with your network. That's very much appreciated. All right, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley Ross. I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology as the executive director, and I'm on board helping to organize the CRED Talk series. The CRED Talks, which are the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, are in their 6th season of operation. And this year is following a theme, climate disruption in the Upper Columbia Basin. We are welcoming 8 scientists for the series, fantastic speakers, and we're really very grateful to have their expertise contributed to the whole talk series. If you are zooming in for just this one talk, I really encourage you to go to the website, cmiae.org, to take a look at the whole suite of speakers that are contributing to this series, because they, as a whole, they tell a much bigger and very important story. Today, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Colin Mahony, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before I do, I want to share some gratitudes. So thank you to the Columbia Basin Trust, who gave us the seed funding to get this series off the ground. Without you, we wouldn't be able to run the show. So thank you very much. The series is also generously supported by all of you. If you're attending these talks today, we know that you've given a donation. And thanks again from the bottom of our hearts. We recognize the support, and it is essential in supporting the production costs of these CRED Talks. So thank you very much. For those of you who are zooming in to check in the recordings after the fact, we've received some donations from you as well. And thank you very much for sending those in. Very much appreciated. Before I go any further, I'd just like to pause for a moment and acknowledge and honor the 4 nations on whose unceded territory I'm zooming in from today in Revelstoke, BC. And that is the Sinixt, the Tanaha, the Secwepemc, and the Silks. And so I can see in the chat that we have a few people who have provided their acknowledgement as well. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for doing that. And I invite the rest of you to do the same. So in the spirit of reconciliation, please share your own land acknowledgement and introduce yourselves. This is also a great opportunity to test out that the chat is working for you. So for those of you who are new to Zoom, and I know that there is at least one of you as I've received your email, if you hover your mouse down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a control panel pop up. And on that control panel, you'll see a whole bunch of icons, and you'll see the chat icon there. So you can click on the chat icon, and you'll have a chat option show up for you, and you can send a message to everyone, which is what I would recommend right now. Or you have the option of sending a message to hosts and panelists, which is the team behind the scenes here, if you'd like to get our attention. So go ahead and put in your acknowledgement there. And thanks very much for those of you who've already done that. So as those flow in, I just want to take the opportunity to quickly tell you about your host organization today, the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, or CMI for short, as we call it. We're a nonprofit society and an association for people working in the various fields of ecology. Our home range is in southern British Columbia, Canada, but increasingly we see membership from across BC into Alberta and up into the north. One of the main things we do is provide professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, and of course, webinars. I have a whole list of examples that I like to provide usually in the introductions, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to leave it at that. And I would just suggest that you go to our website, cmiae.org. You can click on past events and you can check out the types of things that we've done in the past. It'll give you a really good feel for what we do. And of course, check out the homepage to see that, what else we have coming up. We have a number of course announcements who have recently come out, and there's going to be 2 more populating that webpage in the next couple of weeks. So our typical audience is well captured by the mix of people who have registered for this series. And they include representatives from environmental consultants, academics, students, industry representatives, nonprofits, First Nation governments, and provincial and municipal resource managers. So welcome to all of you. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dive into a quick nitty-gritty Zoom orientation. A lot of you don't need this, but it is essential for those of you who do need it. The webinar is being recorded, of course. So these recordings, as I mentioned earlier, are going to be made available on the event webpage, and I really encourage you to share them out. Once all the recordings from the whole series are posted, we'll be doing another round of promo to really get them out there. The webinar today is being delivered in the formal webinar format, which means that the video and the audio have been disabled for attendees. So while we do that regretfully, we would really like to see you and we'd like to engage in more conversation. It does make for a bit of a smoother experience and a smoother delivery. But I wanted to let you know that if you wanted to ask your question orally, we do have the ability of unmuting you. So when we get to the Q&A time, feel free to raise your hand and we'll take that as a hint that you would like to share your question yourself, like actually speak it. And you would do that by using the raise hand function, like I said. And so you can find that again on that bottom toolbar. If you put your hand on the tool or your mouse, sorry, on the bottom toolbar, you'll see the raise hand function. I'll just click it now. And what that does is it'll pop you to the top of the participant list on my end, or the attendee list, and then we'll also see it in other ways, and we'll know that we can unmute you. So I'm going to lower my hand now by clicking on that again. The other thing that we are going to do is so like I mentioned, we have the chat available. That's a great place to share resources. But we're not going to put our questions in the chat. What we're going to do is we're going to use the Q&A function. So again, you find that control panel, click on the Q&A icon, and that opens up a Q&A box. And you have the option then of putting in your question, and then you can do that normal. If you just type it in, it'll show your name. If you wanted to do that anonymously, there's a drop-down menu that allows you to ask an anonymous question. And Marc-Andre, thanks very much, has put in a sample question right now. Do turtles like to roll on their back? He's got the best questions. And we have a couple people who have hit the thumbs up on that question. So that is happening just to demonstrate right now that we have the upvoting function enabled. And what that does is it just allows us to upvote questions we want to hear the answer to. So it looks like a lot of people want to hear the answer to Marc-Andre's question. What this does on my end is I'm going to order the questions so that the most popular questions pop up to the top, and we'll make sure that we get those answered or posed first, so that Colin will have the chance to answer those. Okay, Marc-Andre, thanks for doing that. I think we get the drill. All right, that's it for my orientation. And now, without ado, we can move on to the reason that you're all here today. I would like to welcome Dr. Colin Mahony, who will present Grasping at Familiarity, Making Sense of the New Climates of the Columbia Mountains. I know I've been really looking forward to this talk. Colin is a research climatologist in the BC office of the Chief Forester with the Ministry of Forest, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development. He completed his PhD research on novel climates with Professor Sally Aiken at UBC. And prior to that, he worked as a forestry consultant on the restoration of forests disturbed by mountain pine beetle, wildfire hazard reduction in and around communities, silviculture prescriptions, timber supply analysis, and many other aspects of forest management. Colin's current projects focus on translating global climate model outputs into projections that are useful for ecosystem management. So I'll pass it over to Colin. Thank you so much for making the time for us today. Off to you. There we go. I can see you there.
Okay. Hello, thanks very much for having me. I'm Colin Mahony. I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the city of Victoria in the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. And so I live in Victoria, but I have spent quite a bit of time in the Kootenays. I love the Kootenays, and I met my wife in the Kootenays, so it's got a special special place in my heart. So I'll just share my screen here. All right, so looking good. All right. So just after the heat dome event this summer, I was talking to a colleague from Kamloops, and she made a comment to me that really stuck with me, which was that she's never stepped outside and felt like the air itself could kill her. And I think for me, that really summed up just how shocking the heat dome event was, and this year more broadly. It really was like a palpable feeling of unfamiliarity. And in the event, or in the face of that kind of unfamiliarity, it's very human to grasp at the familiar, to find high ground, to find firm ground. And it struck me that many of the techniques I use in my work are doing just that. They're trying to interpret the changes that we see in terms of aspects of our landscape that we're already familiar with. So I thought I would just provide some of that perspective for you. So I kind of framed this in three big questions. Where are we headed? What will it be like? And how do we navigate? The where are we headed part is really focusing on emission scenarios. I hadn't thought of putting this into the talk until I watched several of the other talks, and emission scenarios came up as being a really important part of or theme running through the different talks, especially concepts of business as usual and worst case. What is the worst case scenario? So I want to spend a bit of time on that because it really does frame how we think about climate change and our future outlook. Then with what will it be like? I'll talk about just kind of simple climate changes, temperature and precipitation, but then a couple of the ways that we have put this into ecological context, including biochromatic projections, and what are some of the limitations of that approach. And finally, how do we navigate? Really, this is just some of my, just a few thoughts on principles of approaching this unfamiliar future that we're facing. So where are we headed? We'll talk about emission scenarios. Whenever we look at projections of climate change, this is typically the kind of thing we see. We have a past, a known past that we've gone through. We get to the present day, and then from there, the uncertainties branch out. So these are showing temperature changes associated with different emission scenarios. There's low emission scenarios that keep us within or even below the Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees Celsius globally. And then all the way up to high emission scenarios where the temperature changes rapidly and keeps changing up to 5 or even 6 or 7 degrees, depending on the uncertainties. So for the last, during the 2010s, the decade of the 2010s, The predominant scenarios were the representative concentration pathways. And we had RCP 2.6, which was kind of a 2-degree scenario, keeping in line with Paris. RCP 4.5, which was a moderate mitigation scenario where emissions decline by the end of the century, but never get to 0. And then RCP 8.5, which was a large ramp up of emissions throughout the century, leading to 5 or more degrees Celsius of global warming. And the key thing is that, in the middle of the last decade, the actual observed emissions were tracking that high scenario. And in fact, all the way back through the history of scenarios, back into the 1990s, they've set out a bunch of scenarios, and then over the years, the emissions track that high scenario. And that really led most observers to call these business as usual scenarios, because that seemed to be the way we were going. So now we have a new set of scenarios called shared socioeconomic pathways. Anytime you look at climate change projections, you will see SSPs as the scenarios for those now. And we have scenarios in this, 4 main scenarios that correspond to the RCPs: the SSP1 2.6, SSP2 4.5, SSP5 8.5, and actually a new scenario, SSP3 7.0. Those are the 4 main scenarios. So because these scenarios are so fundamental to how impacts of climate change are presented, I do want to spend a little bit of time on them and put them into context. The scenarios, these 5 scenarios, SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, describe different parts of the uncertainty space and how the global socioeconomics could develop. So SSP1, sustainability, is a scenario of both the global north and the global south developing with high GDP development, increasing equality between north and south, high coordination between nations, a very globalized world, but doing that all with economics that strongly favor renewables and the phase out of fossil fuels. On the opposite end of the spectrum, SSP3, regional rivalry, this is kind of the Trump-Bolsonaro type scenario where the global order of cooperation really breaks down into nations in conflict with each other. And as a result, actually, there's quite low socioeconomic development in both North and South. SSP4 is inequality. So the North developing along kind of a sustainable pathway, but the global South really stagnating in socioeconomic development. There's SSP5. That is, I should maybe just introduce this plot too. So this plot is just showing GDP per capita in the OECD, which is the richest nations, and then in Middle East and Africa, some of the poorer nations. And it's showing their GDP development up to 2100. And so when we look at SSP5 8.5, we can see that this is a scenario of very high socioeconomic development. It's a very, very optimistic scenario where the global North and the South have both get very rich, and there's high socioeconomic development throughout the world, but it does that all through exploitation of fossil fuels. And then finally, SSP2 is they call it the middle of the road. It's kind of the world we live in, which is where you have some progress in some areas, declines in other areas, and the economics of renewables versus fossil fuels are intermediate. each of these socioeconomic scenarios has many potential pathways it can take depending on the interventions to actively reduce fossil fuels through emissions reductions policies. So the gray areas are where there's no interventions. The gray lines are where there's no interventions. And the colored lines are where there are interventions to reduce fossil fuels. And so this is where these marker scenarios that I highlighted earlier are: SSP 1 2.6, SSP 2 4.5, 3.0, and 8.5. The key thing here is that it's only actually achievable, or this climate forcing of 8.5 watts per square meter is only achievable with this very optimistic assumptions around global development. And I'll loop back to that in a sec. So we have this, the key thing to recognize with this scenario set is they don't have climate change impact feedbacks. So the socioeconomic development pathways aren't impacted in any way by climate change. And this is by design. This is the way the scenario modeling community designed it. So they didn't preempt further impacts of analysis of impacts. But from our perspective, when we look at these scenarios, it's really important to understand this key aspect. They don't have impacts. So SSP 5 8.5 is a world in which the global south is getting rich, but in reality, the impacts of that level of fossil fuel exploitation would make the global south, many areas of the global south, unlivable. So there's a key contradiction there that we need to be aware of when we're looking at that scenario. Regardless of that, there's also the issue of what is business as usual. If we look at coal per capita use over the last century, it's been very stable. There was a small increase in coal per capita due to the large expansion or industrialization of China in the 2000s, but it's leveled off since then, and the International Energy Agency projects further leveling off or even decline of coal use per capita. But RCP 8.5 prescribes a large increase in coal per capita. And it does that, the way you get that large increase is by making coal much cheaper than solar. So in RCP 8.5, coal is 3 times cheaper than solar, when in reality, solar is currently cheaper than coal, and it's projected to become even cheaper. So SSP 5 8.5 is even double the amount of coal use per capita than RCP 8.5. And it's historically unprecedented. So through this lens, these scenarios are not business as usual at all. Even SSP 3 7.0 has an unprecedented intensity of coal use and fossil fuel use in general. But you need this extremely high level of coal use to achieve this 8.5 watts per square meter climate forcing. So now if we look at the trends in CO2 emissions, up until 2014, as I was saying, it was following the RCP 8.5. But since then, and actually since about 2012, CO2 emissions have pretty much leveled off, and they've really fallen off this RCP 8.5 track. This is total CO2 emissions, including land use, and then this is just fossil CO2 emissions, which perhaps is more important when we think about these high emission scenarios. So this really does change the outlook on what is business as usual. And there was a really important paper that published in 2020 in Nature by Housefather and Peters. And they really made this point very succinctly, that we are now on we are much more on a path of RCP 4.5 or SSP2 4.5. And this 5-degree scenario is very unlikely. In fact, it always was unlikely. It never really was business as usual when you look at the assumptions behind it. But we're now on this pathway towards 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warming. And I think this is really important because it reframes what we think of as the worst case scenario. When we were using RCP 8.5 as business as usual, it made RCP 4.5 look like success. When really, if you look at the global dialogue around climate change, 3 degrees of warming or 2.5 degrees of warming consistent with RCP 4.5 is absolutely disastrous. The global south sees it as a death sentence. And the discussion, the dialogue is appropriately around how do we get off RCP 4.5 or SSP2 4.5, which is kind of represented by this scenario, and get it down more towards 2 degrees or less than that. This is where our attention needs to be. I think the key thing being, we can't underestimate how bad RCP 4.5 would be. So that was a really global perspective. And I want to bring it down to the Columbia Mountains. So what will it be like putting climate changes into ecological context? So first, let's just look at the raw ecological or raw climate changes. This is a plot from an app I've made. A lot of the results in here that I'll be showing are from public apps. And you can always get in touch with me if you want me to send you the links to these apps. But this is for the southern interior mountains, basically the Columbia Mountains. The blue is the historical observed temperature. And then the gray and colored envelopes are climate change projections made by global climate models, 8 global climate models. So we have, a lot of noise locally in the temperature change, but there is this upward trend. And we can see 2021 was a record year. And this is very much on the pathway that we're headed. This is RCP, this is SSP 1, 2.6, 4.5, and 7.0. When we look at winter temperatures are even noisier. There has been an upwards trend, and we're projected to see an upwards trend, not quite as much as the summer temperatures. The thing about winter temperatures that's striking is just how the cold temperatures have just been completely lopped off. So we don't see the cold winters that we used to have. And we can think about the mountain pine beetle epidemic as a real manifestation of that, which occurred during this period. So now this is summer precipitation. Overall, the models don't project, collectively don't project strong changes, although individual models, there's some disagreement among models on the change in precipitation. But the way I think about precipitation is it's a very noisy variable. Interannual variability is a huge factor in precipitation. And you can see that these dry years are the years where we have these big impacts of fire. And so precipitation is really it's these extreme years of precipitation that get overlaid onto the warming trend to make the conditions such as fire years worse and worse as time goes on. So just looking at model agreement in precipitation, this is showing an ensemble of models. And this is actually the 2001 to 2020 model projections showing in the labeled dots, and then these other dots are then going out to 2021, 2041, 2061, 2081 to 2100. So overall, annual precipitation is projected to increase as the temperature increases. But if we look at growing season precipitation, May to September, there's a lot of disagreement among models about whether precipitation will increase or decrease. And this gray here is the 2001 to 2020 observed. So May to September is a long period. When we break it out into May and June precipitation, the models generally say project an increase of precipitation with temperature, and this is what we've seen historically. When we look at July, August, September, generally the models are projecting a decline, and we have seen a decline in the later summer precipitation. So really key, this is something that Deb McKillop really highlighted to me many years ago, was this really important difference in precipitation trends at the beginning of the summer versus the end of the summer. When we look at something like precipitation as snow, there's some model disagreement about when we will get certain declines in precipitation as snow, but they're all heading in the same direction. This is with Climate BC data. And then frost-free days, lots of model agreement on declines in frost-free days. So the first way I think about climate changes to contextualize them is in terms of the historical range of experience. We are, up until recently, we've been within the historical range of experience. 2021 was our first, poking our head out of that historical range of experience into unfamiliar climates. And even in the best case scenario, SSP 1 2.6, the climate will be outside that familiar range of experience. But we could be under SSP 2 4.5 well outside it. So as our climates become unfamiliar, we need to think about how we can contextualize these. 2.7 degrees doesn't mean much. How do we contextualize it further? One of the simplest ways to do that is in terms of elevation. So, as we go up, the air gets colder. And so we can actually frame these increases in temperature as an elevational shift required to keep temperature the same at a lapse rate of 0.5 degree per 100 meters. Currently, we're heading into maybe 300 meters of change of elevation. And in the best case scenario, more like 500, 550. And on business as usual scenario, more like 800 meters. Significant shifts in temperature in terms of elevation change. So I wanted to put this into the Columbia Mountains context. This is Rocky Mountain Trench near Cranbrook, and if we put ourselves, halfway on that hill at an elevation of 1,500 meters, there's that point there. This is the actual temperature gradient that we see on these locations. This is quantitative, it's not just conceptual. As the temperature warms as we get multiple degrees of warming, we get those temperatures shifting uphill. And so a species that kind of lives in this area would have to move uphill by that 800 meters or so that I focused on before. And this is for daytime temperatures in the winter. But the problem is that the lapse rates the changes in temperature differ in different seasons, and the climate is changing in different amounts in different seasons. I should say in precipitation, with precipitation increasing, you would actually have a downhill shift required. So, so species are being pushed uphill by temperature, but slightly downhill by precipitation. And then if we look at summer temperature, that's only pushing up by about 400 meters. Summer daytime temperature is 400 meters, but summer nighttime temperature is actually pushing it up by almost 1,000 meters. And then summer precipitation is just a slight uphill movement. So it's not clean. It's not a clean, just uphill movement of the climates. The future climates are, a given species would be pulled in several different directions by the different climate changes in terms of elevational shifts. So this is a useful way of looking at it, but we obviously need other ways of understanding these climate changes in terms of the landscape. So another popular approach is the climate analog approach. This is some figures that I made for BC parks, just showing for the Wells Gray Park area. Yellow is the similar climate to the Wells Gray Park complex. This is the similarity to the historical climates. Then if you look at where the future climates are coming from for the Wells Gray complex, generally they're coming from the south, but also a little bit from the north. Then you can look at where these climates are going to. And the climates of Wells Gray Park are moving into northern British Columbia. So this hints at where source populations of species could come from, or where the Wells Gray Park species would need to go to maintain their climatic equilibrium. So that's just conceptually the climate analog context. When we look, so what's our best source of climate analogs is actually the Biochromatic ecosystem classification. This classification has a climatic component, biochromatic subzones and variants. There's more than 200 of these different climate types in British Columbia, and this is a really useful analog pool. So back in the mid-2000s, Andreas Hamann and Tongli Wang pioneered the approach of translating changes in climate as changes in biochromatic zones. They use a model, a quantitative model to classify biochromatic zones based on climate conditions. And when they apply that model to future climate conditions, what you get is a shifting of the biochromatic zones across the landscape. This approach was adopted by Greg Utzig in a really excellent report in 2012, where he looked at biochromatic projections for the Kootenays. And he found, or he presented very significant differences between different global climate models in the projections they make. It's worth saying that these projections specifically are RCP 8.5 at the end of the century. So they're projecting they're based on very large changes in temperature. So I've recently been collaborating with Will McKenzie, Kiri Doust, and Pam Dykstra on climate change informed tree species selection for reforestation. And this uses updated projections of biochromatic projections. And really, provincially, the trends are IDF moving north, ICH moving north and uphill, contraction of the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir zones. movement of the Engelmann spruce subalpine fir into northern BC. So we've been using those projections to try to understand what are changes in the feasibility of tree species for reforestation. What's the climatic suitability for tree species? And this, for example, is showing in red the decline of lodgepole pine suitability, and in blue the increase of lodgepole pine suitability uphill. One of the key developments in this approach is that Will Mackenzie, Del Mattinger, Tongli Wong have created a preliminary set classification for the Western United States. So that allows us to draw analogs from outside British Columbia's borders, which was a really key shortcoming of previous projections. So let's zoom in on the Columbia Mountains. In the Columbia Mountains, we have 5 main zones: Engelmann spruce subalpine fir, interior cedar hemlock, montane spruce, interior heather alpine, and interior Douglas fir. And so there's these 5 zones, and then there's dozens of Hydrochromatic subzone variants. When we want to make these projections, we have to make a model first. So we use a machine learning model to recognize Hydrochromatic subzone variants based on their climatic attributes. So you can see when we project the model to the period of climate that we've trained it on, 1961 to 1990, it's very similar, but there are differences. There are some subtle differences which you could call model error, but sometimes those are actually created by the climatic mapping. There's several reasons why you get these differences between the mapped and the model. So now just looking at the model zones as a comparison. So we have this is the observed actual climate of 2001 to 2020. This last couple decades was a significantly different climate, and it's really reflected in the biochromatic projections, where we have, it was drier, so we have an expansion of the interior Douglas fir zone. We have significant uphill expansion of the ICH implied in these projections. And also the ingress of bunchgrass climate, like grassland climate from adjacent United States, and this interior grand fir zone as well from Washington and Oregon. If we look at the global climate model ensemble for 2001 to 2020, they actually, the models don't show as significant differences as the recent climate, because the recent climate was a bit more extreme and unusual than the average of the model climate. Going out into the future, this is 2041 to 2060. By mid-century, we have significantly different climates. But other than the bunchgrass and the interior grand fir and some coastal western hemlock, still largely the local climates of the Columbia Mountains. So we can see some of these trends with the decline of the SSF, the increase of the ICH, the ingress of CWH, or coastal western hemlock light climates. And we can see that these coastal western hemlock climates are the dry submaritimes. So they're the climates of the coast interior transition. So they're not exactly the classic coastal rainforest climates. we look at variation among global climate models, there's some variation that you can see between two of the models that are quite different from each other, but really they're all along the same theme. This is a significantly different outlook than what Greg Utzig found in his report, looking at much more extreme climate conditions. So we have interior cedar hemlock zone increasing, Engelmann spruce subalpine fir zone declining. And there's quite a lot of model agreement. So I'll just skip some of these just for the sake of time. When we look out further to the 2070s and 2090s, now we have a substantially changed climatic landscape in the Columbia Mountains. And I just want to pull out what some of these new climates are. So the CWH DS1, these CWH climates in dark green, these are the, and the MS1, these are the coast interior transition. So these are already dry and somewhat cold climates of the coastal western hemlock zone. So it's not outlandish that we'd find these in the montane areas of the Kootenays. A lot of the lower elevation is CWH XM Washington. So Puget Sound kind of climates. Bunchgrass from Washington. Interior Grand Fir zone, a new zone from Oregon. And then finally, even some juniper pine woodland from the Great Basin areas in the Rocky Mountain Trench. So one of the things to evaluate is, are these realistic analogs? Are they credible analogs for the future climates? I'm gonna try something. So I made an app that looks at biochromatic units in a climate space. So this is principal components of climate. So you can see that this is the coast here, coastal Douglas fir, the mountain hemlock, mountain climates of the coast. And then this is the interior, the alpine and northern units up here. And then this is the bunchgrass and ponderosa pine units of the Okanagan Valley. And then the Kootenay climates are here. When we look at I should say we can add the climates of the adjacent United States, label it in blue. And when we look at a trajectory for the ICH-DW1, so this is a valley bottom climate of the West Kootenays, you can see that the trajectory looks like it's going towards this CWH XM Washington unit, but that's really just its best analog. In reality, the global climate models are projecting a trajectory into an area of novel climate space. And so these areas on the map are being labeled as CWH XM, as these coastal, dry coastal units. But in reality, it's a warmer version of the ICH-DW1, and that's our best analog. So this is a really critical thing for us to recognize, is the potential for novel climates to trick us into assigning these analogs and interpreting them at face value. When I did an analysis of climatic novelty in British Columbia, I found that the West Kootenays was a real hotspot for novel climates. These red areas, especially valley bottoms, but even well up into the montane areas, are significantly novel, even in the North American analog pool. So there's some unfamiliarity there. And this year really showed us that there's other modes of unfamiliarity. You know, the heat dome itself was, statistically speaking, extremely spooky. This is just showing the other extreme hottest day of the year for previous years as temperature increased. There is a trend, upwards trend in daily temperature extremes. But this dot up here is the heat dome event. It was way outside the range of all other extremes we've seen. Same here. These are all the hottest days plotted in terms of return period. It's a very smooth, nice curve. And then this up here is the heat dome event. So it was, the heat dome event was like it was from a completely different climate. And that suggests perhaps a regime change in the weather systems that we're experiencing. So that's another mode of unfamiliarity. The smoke season as well is a mode of unfamiliarity. You know, this is the smoke we're experiencing. There isn't an analog out there elsewhere in the landscape where we can go and look for a smoky part of the landscape. It's universally experienced across our landscapes. And it's something that we can't use the analog approach for. And also another one of these universal impacts is the mountain pine beetle epidemic. You know, that was a situation where we had an endemic insect that, given a lot of habitat and also a drastic reduction in its environmental stressors, exploded to scales where it was behaving in completely unfamiliar ways. And we should be aware of what the next impact like this could be. So how do we navigate? So I've shown that there's clear trends and large uncertainties. The temperature rise is certain. So we'll have more drought, less snowpack, worse fire weather, insect and disease outbreaks, ecological malaptation, and less frost. But the ecological responses to these environmental stressors are uncertain. There will be lots and lots of surprises in how our ecosystems respond. So our responses to change are to, basic responses to change are to adjust. And that sounds glib, but there's many things that we've been doing the same way for 30, 40, 50 years in British Columbia. And we do need to reevaluate everything we do and assess whether that's the right approach to take, given the amount of change we have coming at us. We need to choose what we want to protect, not take what we have for granted. The things that we value will need to be actively protected in the face of these kind of changes. And unfortunately, that means triage. We will actually have to prioritize and accept that not everything can be protected. Responses to uncertainty, obviously diversify, monitor. We need to understand what's happening on the landscape and do early detection of problems as they arise. We need to be humble. Our professional and expert knowledge is increasingly eroded by the emergence of these unfamiliar conditions. We also need to be accountable. The stakes of our decisions have never been higher. And we need to be aware of who we can impact with the unintended impacts of our actions. So there's a lot of talk about adaptation. Adaptation, I don't think of it as a solution. It's more like harm reduction. The solution is obviously greenhouse gas emissions reductions. adaptation also is not precise. In the process of adapting, we will make many mistakes, and also we will not have perfect adaptation. But also, it's not optional. We have to face the future that we have. And the key tool we have in facing that future, I believe, in British Columbia is our existing ecological literacy. When we look at the Biochromatic ecosystem classification, exemplified perhaps by the field guides for the Southeast British Columbia, produced by Dan McKillop, there's a huge knowledge base there. Decades and decades of knowledge have gone into the system. But most importantly, it's important for us to recognize that the BEC system and our knowledge systems in general are living systems. It's the people who know the landscape that are most able to interpret the changes that are happening. And so just to close, I've been talking a lot about changes in the shifts in the climatic conditions, which you interpret in terms of biochromatic shifts, but really these biochromatic maps perhaps are more useful as fixed, enduring features, and it's our knowledge of the processes, ecological processes that are happening inside those units that are most important. And that's not just the ecological experts, but it's really every one of us needs to increase our ecological literacy so we can understand climate changes in our landscapes. And I just want to acknowledge my key contributors. Many of these projections were developed by Will Mackenzie, who is becoming one of the experts on biochromatic projections in British Columbia. Thank you very much.
Great presentation, Colin. Thank you very much. Wow, it was wild to see those heat dome tables and charts with the dot way off, because that was the lived experience for sure. It just clearly did not feel right. I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that. Okay, everybody, so just a reminder, we're going to move into questions. You're welcome to put your question. You're invited, in fact, and encouraged to put your questions into the Q&A. And if you see a question there that you'd like to hear an answer to, then give it the thumbs up, and that'll order those popular questions up to the top. And I'll just relay the questions to Colin as they appear. We actually, and I recognize that it's 1 o'clock and many of you might need to go, but Colin does have a little bit of extra time here to deal with questions, and you can always return to the recording to hear the Q&A. Do we have any questions? Okay, we have a question from Mel. You might want to pull up the Q&A and read this along with me because it's a longer question. Okay, so Mel Reesner asks, reported CO2 emissions have leveled off since 2000, but the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has not and is continuing to accelerate. This suggests that the efficacy of some carbon sinks may be diminishing. What's your feeling on increased CO2 emissions from BC forests related to the increase in wildfire activity, and how feedback of this nature on a global scale may impact future emission scenarios?
Thank you, Mel. Yeah, I'm thinking of where to start, because there's several different aspects to that. So we have seen in British Columbia, British Columbia's forests have gone from being a carbon sink to being a source, and that occurred with the mountain pine beetle epidemic. They've been a source ever since. I think we do need to be very ecologically oriented when we think about our forests as sinks, and asking questions of, in individual ecosystems, is the carbon in that ecosystem safe and stable? Some ecosystems may already be overstocked with carbon, and when we see fires happening, that's those ecosystems returning to a more natural carbon storage potentially. On the other hand, there are certainly opportunities to increase carbon storage in other forests, and so we really need an ecologically nuanced perspective on carbon storage. Also say in global climate models, the carbon cycle in these models is often very simple, and some of the models don't even have much of a carbon cycle. So even with RCP 4.5, we can see there's some uncertainty and potential for higher levels of greenhouse gas concentrations due to declines in, or due to feedbacks in the carbon cycle.
Okay, thanks for tackling that. Our next question is coming from Robin Taylor, and she says, have you developed recommended lists of climate resilient tree species for planting in the next 5 years for different areas of the province?
So we have been working on the science basis for understanding climate resilient tree species for planting, but it is not currently a policy in British Columbia.
Okay, great. Question from Shannon, how many research climatologists are there in Flynn Row?
So there's two. There's Vanessa Ford is a longstanding research climatologist based out of the North area. So currently 2 of us, hopefully more in the future.
Yeah, hopefully. Okay, great, thanks. So we've got a question from Tyne Baker. Hi, Tyne. How does the concentration of areas unknown, how does the concentration of areas unknown climates in BC compared to other areas? Are there other geographic areas where the land will be covered by more or less deviance from locally known or represented climates? Can you see that there?
Yeah, so this is referring to the novel climates. So I saw some, so we see novel climates throughout North America. This was research that I did during my PhD. Within North America, the big area of novel climates is actually in the Southeast states, the Gulf states, which are universally moving into novel climates, as you can kind of understand. In BC, we see novel climates primarily emerging in the valleys, the valley bottoms of especially the southern interior, but also we see it along the outer coast of British Columbia as well. Because you can imagine, as we look for warmer and wetter analogs to those future climates of the outer coast of British Columbia, when we look south, those are warmer, drier climates. So we really don't see good analogs for the coastal climates along the outer coast.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna address this one right away. Greg Utzig just has a slight correction. He says that the Utzig projections are not all high emission scenarios, but rather a mix of models and scenarios as recommended by the PCIC.
Right, okay, yeah, thanks, Greg. I wanted to mention that I think 2 of them were 8.5 scenarios and one was, I can't remember if it was a 4.5. But I think what I wanted to emphasize was, I think with an outlook on 8.5 being higher than business as usual, that the uncertainty actually in the model disagreement is not as great. And so, that was a key challenge looking at those high emission scenarios, is how to choose between those extremely different futures. from the perspective of the projections that I've made, I think that the path is much clearer of where things are going from a biochromatic perspective.
Great. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Question from Christy Iverson. She says, do we expect to see a greater degree of variability in temperature and precipitation in future climates? So for example, frost-free days are projected to decrease, but are we likely to see extremes that make it difficult for frost-sensitive tree species to adapt to new climates?
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a few different ways to look at that. So that's, first, I would say that's a key research question for us. It's not a given what the answer to that is. And that's one of the things that Greg O'Neill has been pestering me to answer. And that's a priority for future research. If we look at the past, what's actually happened is that these cold temperatures have actually decreased faster than the warm temperatures. So variability in observations has declined. The global climate models don't show a clear pattern of increasing variability. But on the other hand, when we think about changes in atmospheric dynamics, and especially Arctic amplification influences on the jet stream, the potential for the jet stream to become wavier and slower, then that would result in hotter heat waves and also some colder Arctic outbreaks, so higher variability. So it could happen. We haven't seen it yet.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. Okay, so now we'll move on. Peter Tarleton has a question. Hi, Peter. He says, thanks, Colin. And to that effect, there are a number of other things in the chat that you'll want to look at before you sign off here today. So, and he says, can you speak to how changes in climate envelopes might outpace the migration of individual species? So for example, what happens in a novel climate if species like grand fir don't migrate north fast enough?
Yeah, there's every indication that will be the rule rather than the exception. We name these climate types after the plant species that we find there. But we're really just modeling climate types. We're not modeling vegetation communities. So the interior grand fir climate, something similar to it moves into the low elevations of the Kootenays. Doesn't mean grand fir is coming along. But it does mean potentially, if potentially grand fir could be planted, but that would be a social decision. Generally, the species will lag by decades or centuries behind the movement of these climates.
Okay. Interesting question from Laura Sachs. She says, the heat dome shows that the models don't catch the extremes very well, even in the global temps still below 1.5 degrees Celsius. What are your thoughts on how to plan for uncertainties and short-term extreme events to build resilience in our landscapes or ecosystems as we move forward?
That is a good question. I don't have a good answer to that second question. I will say that there was a paper that came out almost just as the heat dome was happening in Nature that showed that the global climate models do actually have these record-shattering events in them if you look for them, but people just hadn't really looked for them much before. They are in the models, but this question of how to prepare for them, I would need to answer that at 9 a.m., not 1:15.
Yeah, it's a good big picture question, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks, Colin. That's the last question for now, and I think that's good for our timing. It's just 10 after 1. I can see that Peter just shared. Oh, thanks for doing that, Pete. He shared the Cred Talks event webpage in the chat. So that's where you'll find the recording to this talk, previous talks, and the one to come. And yeah, Laura says it's sobering. Thanks, Colin, for your time. So yeah, I want to echo that sentiment. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for keeping on with this work and for sharing it with us. hard questions to answer, absolutely, as is the situation. So before we end today, I just want to wrap up with another round of thank yous. So of course, again, thank you to Colin and the ministry for providing your time to update us today. Thank you to the Columbia Basin Trust for your financial support. Big thank you to everyone who donated to the series. Very much appreciated, as I said before. I just want to echo again the sentiment that I'd love for you to share these recordings with your network. Send the event webpage to your colleagues and people who you think might benefit from hearing this information. Next week, we have Dr. Mike Flanagan joining us. He's the research chair for the Predictive Services of Emergency Management and Fire Science at the Thompson Rivers University. Mike's work is quite renowned, and the picture he paints, I'm sure, will be shocking to many. We're lucky that he set time aside for us. So you don't want to miss this talk. It's entitled Climate Change and Wildfires in BC, What Does the Future Hold? The talk will take place next week, same time, March 3rd, 12 p.m. Pacific. And you can contact me if you have any questions at all. That's it for today. Thanks very much for your time, everyone. And Colin, just have a look at that chat before you log off. All right.
Thanks very much, everyone.